This is the 11th video from It Can Happen Here, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting the personal freedoms guaranteed to Americans by the Bill of Rights. In these videos, we've been exploring the claims that Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate in 2024, wants to be a fascist dictator. In our first 10 videos, we tried to define fascism and to infer what a fascist dictatorship would mean for the rights and freedoms provided by the First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, and Ninth Amendments to the Constitution. Regrettably, we concluded that, if Donald Trump became an American fascist dictator, he would probably take away almost all of those precious rights and freedoms. If Trump does become a fascist dictator, we now know that his election would be disastrous for American freedoms. So we must dispassionately assess whether that is his ambition. Many have argued that, since Trump did not become a fascist dictator during his prior term as president, he won't do it this time. That argument ignores the events of January 6, 2021, when, according to federal prosecutors, he encouraged a mob to attack the U.S. Capitol in order to overturn the 2020 election so he could remain in power. Even before the 2020 election, however, there was debate over whether Trump's words and actions as president qualified him as a fascist. Experts profess concern about his proposed Muslim ban and Muslim registry, his unrelenting anti-immigrant and anti-minority rhetoric, his refusal to denounce the neo-Nazis for their violence in Charlottesville, his unapologetic acceptance of other extreme and violent supporters, his persistent efforts to discredit the upcoming 2020 presidential election, claiming it would be rigged if he didn't win, and his encouragement of the lock her up chants at his campaign rallies. After Trump lost the election to Joe Biden, he immediately claimed that he had actually won, and the results were caused by widespread voter fraud. Over the next 2 months, Trump and his supporters failed dozens of times to change the election results by filing baseless lawsuits, arm-twisting local election officials, and other unscrupulous tactics. In a fiery speech on January 6, 2021, Trump encouraged a crowd of fervent supporters to march on the U.S. Capitol to prevent Vice President Pence and Congress from certifying the ballots cast by the Electoral College. Several people died in the ensuing riot, while members of Congress and the Vice President ran for safety from the mob, only returning late that night to complete the election certification process. To many, January 6th confirmed that Donald Trump would stop at nothing, including violence, to stay in power, the hallmark of fascist authoritarianism. Trump was initially condemned and discredited for his role in inciting the January 6th riot, even by members of his own political party. He was also indicted by a federal grand jury for inciting the riot. Trump nevertheless continued to declare his big lie, baselessly claiming that the 2020 election was stolen from him. He even argued that the January 6th rioters' attempt to block certification of the election was an act of patriotism. A substantial majority of Republicans' primary voters continued to believe his big lie, and Trump easily won the Republican presidential nomination. Adolf Hitler is widely credited with inventing the idea of the big lie in the Nazi Bible, Mein Kampf. In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility, because the masses would not believe others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Hitler's most notorious big lie was about Jews, whom he proclaimed to be the sinister cause of Germany's loss in World War I and of the national ignominy and economic collapse that followed. Hitler's big lie was used to magnify Germany's existing anti-Semitism and eventually justify the Nazis' extermination of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Since he was nominated, Trump has used increasingly incendiary language in support of his big lie. On Veterans Day, echoing Hitler and Mussolini, he pledged to root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country that lie and steal and cheat on elections. Trump has also echoed Hitler's words by persistently claiming that immigrants are poisoning the blood of America. Fascists like Hitler and Mussolini intimidated their opponents with threats of violence. In 2023, Trump said that Mike Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, committed treason by assuring the Chinese that the United States had no plans to attack China in the waning days of his administration and deserves to be put to death. Trump's opinion of Milley was likely affected by recent reports that Milley had described the January 6th attack on the Capitol as an attempted coup d'état reminiscent of the Reichstag that gave rise to Nazi Germany. In 2023, Trump also said that his indictment in New York for the Stormy Daniels hush money cover-up would result in death and destruction. Later, in 2023, Trump urged his loyalists to go after Letitia James, the New York Attorney General who filed a civil suit against him for fraudulent business records. More recently, the scope of Americans being threatened by Trump has broadened. For example, he said that lawyers, political operatives, donors, voters, and election officials who were involved in unscrupulous behavior in connection with his loss in the 2020 presidential elections will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels never seen before in our country. The threats against voters for unscrupulous behavior, whatever that means, are particularly alarming. In his 2024 Veterans Day speech, Trump went into full Joe McCarthy mode against his fellow Americans when he said, "The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. Our threat is from within." Trump's defenders say that because he has a penchant for colorful language and his speeches are usually unscripted, his remarks are often taken out of context to sound threatening. For example, they point to his widely condemned prediction of a bloodbath if he isn't elected, which in context could have referred to an economic disaster, not violence. Trump supporters also cite the avalanche of litigation against Trump since he left office, which they say justifies his tough talk that shouldn't be taken as a true statement of his intentions. Finally, they say that the repeated claims by Democrats that Trump is a threat to democracy compel Trump to use equally dramatic language opposing them. Even if Trump's defenders are correct, it would take a huge leap of faith to assume that Trump would never transform the United States into a fascist dictatorship. Trump's actions on January 6th and his countless threats of violent retribution against his enemies are simply too much to dismiss as just loose talk. They are much more serious than Trump's locker room talk in the Billy Bush tapes in 2016. The risk isn't just that the president might be a creep who disrespects and abuses women. This time the stakes are much, much higher. The first 10 videos in this series from It Can Happen Here painstakingly examined the likely effect of a fascist takeover on each of our rights and freedoms under the Bill of Rights. We concluded that Americans will lose most of those precious freedoms to a fascist dictator, including our freedom to speak our minds, our right to own a gun, our protections from 24-hour-a-day government surveillance, and our rights to be treated fairly by the government generally. It would be life-changing for every American. Next time we will discuss whether, if Trump does try to become a fascist dictator, he could successfully overcome the democratic institutions that have protected American freedoms for more than 200 years. In other words, we will be examining whether fascism really can happen here.